Hi, and welcome back to the Empathic Leader, where we talk all things EQ, empathy, and leadership. I am Dr. Melissa Robinson-Winemiller, and I'm so happy to have you here. As anybody who's heard me talk knows, I'm very passionate about this subject, but I'm passionate about getting other people talking about this subject. If we just read about it, we research it, we learn about it, that's fantastic. But it doesn't have true power until we get it out and are conversing with other people, are allowing this to ripple out so that other people can tap into the power of empathy and the power of emotional intelligence. And do I actually believe that? Yeah, I do. So thank you for being here on this journey with me. I'm so excited to get into it today because I actually want to talk about why empathy fatigue may not be what you think it is. So we spend time talking about empathy fatigue, right? Where you just give and give and give and give so much that you burn yourself out. And this shows up especially in certain situations, people in leadership, right? Because you're dealing with large groups of people, because you're trying to help navigate really complex emotional situations. People in healthcare, you're dealing with very high-level emotional situations. People in education. Anytime you're dealing with large groups of people, you can run afoul of empathy fatigue. But what if these people aren't burning out because they care too much? What if they're actually burning out because they're navigating constant emotional complexity without boundaries and without replenishment? Let's back this up and talk about these just a little bit. Because I think it's important to understand that empathy fatigue isn't something that we have no control over. We have a choice. Anybody who's listened to me or read my book or listened to my podcast knows I am very firm on the fact that having empathy does not mean you don't have boundaries. If you give and give and give and give until there's nothing left, you haven't set good boundaries in place. And not to be rough about it, but that's nobody's fault but yourself. Boundaries are imperative to have, especially when you're dealing with groups that are going to tax a lot of empathy. And one of these boundaries that we can put into place is being able to understand the difference between affective or emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. When it reaches a point as a leader, as an educator, as someone in medicine, that you just cannot give that much of yourself anymore, that's when you flip the switch to be able to use cognitive empathy, that I logically understand what you're going through. I logically understand the implications of this situation. I logically understand what this could mean for this group of people, but I'm not feeling it. I know it's old and really cliched, but we hear the, you can't pour from an empty glass, right? But it's true. You can't help others if you've got nothing to give. So if you are someone that cares a lot, if you are someone that really wants to help people, that really wants to be able to dig in and give, don't give so much that you're tapped out, because then you have nothing to give. And you've run contrary to what it is that you want to do. Boundaries are incredibly important. And it's not something that you should just put up in the moment. It's something that you need to think about. Where is too far? This is really important because we talk a lot about empathy fatigue, especially right now, but it isn't the empathy that's burning you out. I think I've told this story before, but I used to work for a medical facility, specifically for someone who was a reproductive specialist. And about half of what his job was working with patients who were trying to conceive. And it's really complex, and there can be a lot of reasons why couples aren't able to conceive. But the emotionality of that job was high. And the institution that I was in had no empathy. This place was devoid of empathy, which you'd think for a big medical facility that maybe they would have had some, but they didn't. The doctor I worked with was great. The group that he was in, not so much. So over time, partially because of the lack of empathy in this facility, and partially because of the high emotional toll that the patients took on me, I did burn out. I had empathy fatigue bad. But that was nobody's fault but my own. I was young enough that I didn't understand how to put up boundaries and not give so much of myself that there wasn't anything left to give. It's hard when you have empathy to be able to put those boundaries up, but you have to take care of yourself first. Again, the old adage about, put your own oxygen mask on before you put it on for the person next to you. Which also brings us back to self-empathy. When these sorts of things happen, where you end up with empathy fatigue, where you end up with this empathy burnout, you have to begin with a little self-reflection and self-awareness. This isn't working. Yeah, maybe I think I'm doing the right things and I'm helping people, but I'm not. Through this self-reflection and self-awareness, you can lead to self-empathy and be able to say, these boundaries are actually a healthy thing. I have to be able to take care of myself first so that I can take care of everybody else. And that's not being selfish, and that's not withholding myself. That's not anything that I'm doing wrong. I have to give myself this empathy, what I'm feeling for myself, and the connection and understanding with myself, so that I can show myself self-compassion, the action that goes along with empathy. And that compassion is to put up the boundaries that you need. For those of you in leadership positions, now is an especially trying time. I think we could probably say that all the way through history, but with some of the social climate of things that are happening, some of the friction between generations, some of the friction with AI, living in a technological culture, we're navigating things in leadership that we've never really seen before, much less all at once. It's a lot of emotional complexity. Self-reflection leads to self-awareness, leads to self-empathy. Through self-empathy, we can show self-compassion, which can help us avoid burnout by putting up the boundaries that we need. That lack of reflection also leads to a lack of recovery. If you go out and you run a marathon, you don't expect your body to be able to just do the same thing the next day without any kind of recovery. But we send our leaders in to these same complex emotional places day after day after day after day and expect them to do it over and over again. We have this weird idea that, or at least in our society, that if there isn't a physical manifestation of something, then it wasn't damaging. It wasn't painful. It didn't cause problems. And that's not true. I think our mental health professionals are starting to be able to change the minds and hearts of people on this. But just because there isn't a physical wound doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt. If we don't take the time to replenish ourselves, self-empathy and self-compassion, having that time to self-reflect, you're layering on damage on top of damage on top of damage. It's not going to end well. And it's no wonder why our leaders burn out. Middle managers, there was a study that was done, and the rate of burnout among middle managers was like 42%, and leaders was like 37%, for reasons like this. And I don't know about you, but I don't want someone leading me who is so burnt out with empathy fatigue that they don't feel anything. They're missing a big part of leading. So taking the time to reflect and replenish is a major part of this so that you can keep being that superstar exemplary leader that understands that the human factor is what comes first. Another thing that can lead into this is what's called emotional labor. And what that is the hidden effort of managing other people's feelings. Remember when we talk about emotional intelligence? We go back to our basic definition. I know. It's me and definitions again, but sorry, you're not going to get away from it. So the original definition, right, of emotional intelligence is being able to manage and control your emotions and understand the emotions of others. As a leader, you do spend a certain amount of time managing other people's emotions. It's part of the job, layoffs happen, emotions are high. We're in an inflationary period and maybe things aren't going very well because of tariffs and outside influences, emotions are high. People are concerned about AI taking jobs or even just making them obsolete. Just making them obsolete. You know what I mean. Emotional labor is high. As a leader, this is something you take on for large groups sometimes that other people don't necessarily deal with on that scale. Same thing with education when you're dealing with groups of people. When I was a professor, I would feel this a lot. Now, I was dealing with college students. So I was dealing with a subsection where they're learning how to be adults. They may be out of the house for the first time. They're trying to figure out how to fit in and basically, how to hang, how to adult. And there was lots of them. And there was a certain amount for me as a professor that I wanted to help them. And I was managing their feelings. I did a lot better with boundaries in that context because I just understood better what they were going through. And I knew how far too far was for me. But that emotional labor does take a toll, and it's something to be cognizant of if you don't want to run afoul of it and end up with empathy fatigue. So really what we're saying is that empathy fatigue actually has nothing to do with empathy. What it has to do with is poor emotional boundaries, lack of recovery or reflection, and overexposure without the tools you need to be able to handle the emotional labor yourself. So let's talk about real-world impact, because we see it all the time, right? When I talk about unempathic leadership, there are those that have no empathy. There will always be a subsection of society that just maybe aren't the best people. However, a lot of this is just because of leaders that have been in a situation where maybe they've given too much, or they haven't been able to make a change they wanted to, or it just didn't work out like they thought. And this leader might become withdrawn or reactive or robotic. And it's not because they don't care. In fact, it's just the opposite. It might be because they cared too much without the right boundaries. I see this a lot in middle managers where they see some of the stuff that the top level leaders bring down without really understanding what the implications are for their people or for the organization, and they're powerless to do anything about it. And after a while, they just give up because either they protect their mental health and their job, or they blow. So you'll see this a lot. And there are people that, they'll kind of get, they're just checked out. They're not part of the team. They don't really care about their job. But empathy would ask us to say why, right? Because empathy at its best, as we've said, works in both directions. So if there's someone who's showing up this way, especially someone that was known not to be that way before, what happened? Why do they feel they have to withdraw rather than put up appropriate boundaries and take care of their team? This might be a nurse manager who stops showing up emotionally for his team. It might be someone like a principal who just starts avoiding conflict. It might be the CEO who's always on, but doesn't connect with anyone, stays in their office, stays away. It's a way to deal with it. It is a way to deal with empathy fatigue, but it's not the best way. And at the end of the day, as our studies have shown, as we've talked about as a leader, by not employing empathy, you do decrease profit, productivity, and innovation. While those aren't the only reasons to do business, when we do that well within organizations flourish. So it's something to be very aware of. So how do we avoid this? How do we move from emotional exhaustion to empathic intelligence? Because it's a real thing. You have to use regulated, skillful empathy. Now, remember, we've talked over and over again how empathy is a skill, right? It's skill-based. It can be learned. It can be taught, at least to some degree. If you think of this as a skill, as something that you employ actively, suddenly a lot of the emotional friction is gone. All right? So we're actually taking cognitive empathy and adding it in with affective empathy. Emotional intelligence, you use your empathy to connect to that. And you understand that you want to pause, you want to reflect, you want to respond, but you don't want to absorb all of this, right? Name, normalize, and process your emotions before helping others. Help yourself first, self-empathy. Boundaries and recovery. We already talked about that, but I actually can't say it enough. I see this happen over and over again in leaders. They'll expend all their empathy at work, and then they'll go home and do it for their families. And they wonder why, without a break, they're done. Their empathy fatigue has just left them tapped out. Burnout is something we talk about a lot, right? But this empathy fatigue is part of burnout. It's part of just not being able to engage. And if empathy is about connection and understanding, then that inability to engage on a human-to-human level anymore is a big problem. And our organizations need to take some responsibility for some of this as well, right? We talk about management where you run people like a machine, right? It's something to be fixed. It's something to be regulated. It's something to be controlled and commanded. People aren't machines, nor should they be. Why would we want them to be? It's the beautiful humanity that allows for innovation, that allows for creativity. It's the things that AI can't do. It's the things that machines can't do. But we have to be careful to not take on all of that overload. If there's one thing that I could leave this conversation with, it's that recognition that empathy is a skill and that you are not a sponge. That part of this skill is being able to use self-empathy to make sure that you don't take on so much emotional baggage from everything else and from the job and from the leadership position that you burn yourself out. Part of this is emotional literacy, and part of this is continuing to build your EQ skills, right? And we talk about how you use empathy, the connection and understanding, to connect to these EQ skills and understand what you need. Maybe you don't need to motivate yourself harder. Maybe you need to take a moment and understand yourself and what's going on. Many of the leaders that I've known are very talented, very ambitious, and very high self-actualizing. So if you think of the pyramid, right, by Abraham Maslow, right, at the bottom is like basic needs and safety. And then as you go up at the very, very top, the part that we are all supposed to be going for is self-actualization. The part where we actually come into ourselves and understand ourselves. But when you are that level of self-actualizing, you can drive yourself really hard. And when you continually drive yourself that hard, you can lose touch with empathy with yourself because you're continually driving, and you lose that empathy with other people because pretty soon you're driving them just as hard. This is a recipe for burnout. And you can call it empathy fatigue, but it's not really empathy's fault if someone didn't manage it well. Empathy isn't the enemy. There's already too many myths out there about empathy to add in that it's the reason why you have empathy fatigue, or I have empathy fatigue, or there's empathy fatigue in society. Empathy isn't the problem. Exhaustion is. Learning to lead with your heart and boundaries at the same time might be the most radical thing a leader can do. Thank you so much for joining me on this conversation today. Please like, subscribe, and comment. And I'm looking forward to coming to you next week with another great guest. Thanks so much.